We remain steadfast and made it clear our unwavering solidarity with Lucifer. Sally Cromwell is not new to MIT. She doesn't know how we operate here. We will shut down.
The presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn were all asked the following question under oath at a recent congressional hearing on anti-Semitism. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate your university's code of conduct or rules regarding bullying or harassments? The answers they gave were frankly shameful and unacceptable.
But you've heard chants for intifada.
I've heard chants which can be anti-Semitic depending on the context.
Magill, at Penn, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's rules or code of conduct? Yes or no?
If the speech turns into conduct, it can be harassment. Yes.
I am asking specifically calling for the genocide of Jews. Does that constitute bullying or harassment?
If it is directed and severe or pervasive, it is harassment.
So the answer is yes.
It is a context-dependent decision.
And Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
The context, the context, the context. That's how all three female presidents, from Dr. Claudine Gay at Harvard, Elizabeth Magill at Penn, and Sally Kornbluth at MIT, all frame their responses to that question. It depends on the context whether calls for the genocide of Jews violates their university's code of conduct. The Penn president in particular made a revealing comment on how little she actually cared.
It is a context-dependent decision, Congresswoman.
It's a context-dependent decision. That's your testimony today. Calling for the genocide of Jews is depending upon the context. That is not bullying or harassment. This is the easiest question to answer yes, Ms. Magill. So is your testimony that you will not answer yes?
If it if the
Yes
speech
or
becomes
no?
if the speech becomes conduct, it can be harassment. Yes.
Conduct meaning committing the act of genocide?
So genocide of Jews under those circumstances would have to happen in order for Penn to take action? Seriously? And if you think the nuanced responses from these three supposed leaders were appropriate, consider these 3 points. First, if we replaced Jews with any other ethnic group, the reactions would be very different. Can you imagine what the response would have been from these three university presidents had the Ku Klux Klan marched through their campuses instead of pro-Palestinian and pro-Hamas protesters? Had men in white robes carrying torches stomp through their courtyards and public spaces? They tried to argue that the Palestinian and Hamas supporters were generally not targeting individuals, which made a difference in their minds. But how could their calls for intifada and genocide against Jews not severely impact individual Jewish students? Surely they would have felt otherwise had it been black students in response to a KKK march. They would have argued that this type of demonstration was incitement, that it was bullying or at least harassment. I know that because of point number 2, microaggressions. Since at least 2015, these same universities have pushed prohibitions and trainings on microaggressions, which, in short, are statements that might offend even one person from a protected or favored group. And importantly, it didn't even matter if the statement was well-intentioned. All that mattered was that somebody was offended by it, or could be offended by it. The reaction from these three university presidents, including many others like them, they're not alone, demonstrate that they simply don't view Jewish students as part of a protected or favored group like they do black students. For Jews, it all depends on context. We should call this type of double standard what it is. Let's use the language pushed by these universities to define it: institutional anti-Semitism. anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, this is nothing new, which leads me to point number 3. The history of anti-Semitism on college campuses is long and dark. I won't go into all of it here, but just consider what happened recently at the University of Virginia in 2017 during the early days of the Trump administration, when demonstrators marched and chanted, "Jews will not replace us." If university presidents don't think these types of hateful demonstrations on campus detrimentally impact Jewish students, they're willfully blind. They aren't trying to discover the truth. One student at MIT highlighted her experiences and those of her fellow Jews at a press conference.
Whose identity and personal info was sold online for a bounty has not left his dorm room in weeks out of fear due to death threats. For my part, I was forced to leave my study group for my doctoral exams halfway through the semester because my group members told me that the people at the Nova Music Festival deserved to die because they were partying on stolen land. After a postdoc at MIT said that Jewish Israelis want to enslave the world in a global apartheid system, he falsely claimed that Israel harvests Palestinian organs and implied that the, quote, average Israeli is a Nazi. The DEI officer of his department replied by telling us that nothing he said was hate speech and that the organ harvesting conspiracy theory was, quote, confirmed. Day after day, the MIT administration has failed to enforce its own rules on anti-Semitic actors, such as the interfaith chaplain intimidating Jewish students, DEI staff publicly declaring that Israel has no right to exist, faculty dismissing student concerns for their safety by telling them that if they are scared, they should just go back to Israel. CAA protesters blocking the hallways, storming the offices of the MIT Israel internship offices and harassing the staff and faculty there, and inviting dangerous outsiders to campus to join them in yelling hateful and violent chants.
Let's talk more, though, about anti-Semitism and whether it's appropriate to link it with anti-Zionism. Some argue that combining the two conflates the issues. They argue that whether Jews deserve a state on what many view as Palestinian land, which is the core belief of Zionists, is separate and distinct from discrimination against Jews as an ethnic group. I would be more sympathetic to that argument if Israel were not the only Jewish state in the world. And by the way, Israel isn't even 100% Jewish. There are Muslim Israelis too. Yes, Arabs are citizens of Israel too. Unbelievable. Compare that to the 20 plus Arab states around the world and tell me how many Jews are citizens of those countries. Practically none. To strip away the only home that Jews have from the river to the sea, which literally means from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, stripping away the entire state of Israel from the Jews is practically a death sentence. So those types of chants on college campuses, from the river to the sea, or calling for a global intifada, which calls for aggressive, i.e. violent, resistance against not only Israel, but all who support her, these chants are all anti-Semitic. Where do these people expect Jews to go if they are successful at destroying the state of Israel? Many of these universities have intensive courses studying the history of racism and discrimination. Few ethnic groups can rival the amount of racism and discrimination that Jews have faced since the dawn of man. From Egypt to Nazi Germany, Jews have been discriminated against and labeled outcasts in practically every society they've tried to integrate into. And by the way, if Palestine just belonged to Palestine, do you really think they would let any Jews live there? It doesn't work the same way as it currently does in Israel, where there are many, it's not a majority, but there's still a decent number of Arab Israelis. This fact that Jews were so outcast in every society that they tried to integrate into was a main driver of Zionism. That and, of course, the Holocaust. Hell, even people like German philosopher Nietzsche were sympathetic to the Zionist movement. That really says something. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism for those reasons. To be very clear, though, that doesn't mean you can't criticize the state of Israel. There's much to criticize. Indiscriminate bombings of civilians, far-right political groups, authoritarian leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu who purposely weaken democratic institutions. But criticism of Israel is far different from calling for the destruction of Israel. The people who call for that, yelling from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free, and similar slogans, are no better than racists calling for enslavement or genocide of a different ethnic group. It really shocked me how these three university presidents in particular have responded to such hatred. That is incredibly intimidating and harassing to Jewish students. As I said earlier, it's strong evidence of the gross double standard of institutional anti-Semitism at some of the most elite college, higher education institutions in America. So the question is now, what can be done? Well, for starters, we can all denounce anti-Semitism on college campuses. This should be simple. And while all three of these university presidents did so, denouncing anti-Semitism that is, in their opening statements, when questioned later by Representative Elise Stefanik, it was clear that their position was not actually so clear. It was nuanced. It was context dependent.
Anti-Semitic rhetoric, when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board.
Congress could denounce anti-Semitism unanimously, which they attempted to do recently. The only problem? More than half of House Democrats declined to back the Republican-written resolution, with some arguing that equating criticism with the state of Israel with hatred of Jewish people was going too far. That resolution, though, did not equate mere criticism of Israel with hatred towards Jews, but specifically anti-Zionism, which, as described earlier in this point, should equate to anti-Semitism. They're effectively the same thing. Regardless, the resolution denouncing anti-Semitism passed by a vote of 311 to 14, drawing the support of all but one Republican. 92 Democrats voted present. I guess they didn't want to be on the record as anti-Semites, actually voting no. 95 Democrats, to their credit, supported the resolution along bipartisan lines. This reveals the biggest rift in the Democratic Party in years, something Biden will need to bridge if he's going to have any chance against Donald Trump in November of 2024. Another solution: get foreign money out of American universities. Arab countries have given at least $8 billion to elite Ivy League universities in America over the past few decades. Not just limited to the Ivy Leagues, by the way, either. It spans the gamut of elite higher education institutions in America. Top donors to these American universities are Arab countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Egypt. Qatar was the largest source of funding, donating roughly $5 billion, and was followed by Saudi Arabia, donating roughly $3 billion. Should we be surprised then that there's an anti-Israel bias in America's top higher educational institutions? The solution here is simple: ban foreign money. The massive endowments from these top schools will barely notice. We cannot have places where we educate the best and brightest in America beholden in any way to the demands of foreign countries when it comes to making educational or administrative decisions, like how to enforce their codes of conduct. You cannot tell me that billions of dollars do not come with at least some strings attached. And speaking of strings attached, federal grants and tax-exempt status of these universities should come with strings attached too. If universities refuse to enforce their own codes of conduct equally, whether it's to protect Black students, Hispanic students, Jewish students, or any other ethnic or minority group, they should be subject to investigation and the potential loss of federal grant money and the enjoyment of tax-exempt status. There should be no support or rewards from American taxpayers to institutions of higher education that create unsafe and hostile environments for certain classes of students. It is antithetical to our democratic values as a country, and it's particularly troubling coming from places of higher education that are designed to mold and nurture the minds of young people in America. There should be new or enhanced legislation to strip federal funds and or the tax-exempt status of these schools should they fail to enforce their codes of conduct equally. Finally, we need more intellectual diversity in higher education. We have diversity, equity, and inclusion for everything but political ideology. None of the university presidents, when asked, could tell Congress how many conservatives worked at Harvard, Penn, or MIT. That's a problem, folks. It doesn't need to be broadcasted at universities, just as we wouldn't ask someone to broadcast their diversity when walking around campus, but it should be another data point that's maintained alongside all of the other diversity metrics these schools keep. Almost all of these schools at this point have DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion chairs. So make it a part of that person's job or that department's job. If we want a truly enriching environment for everyone, all perspectives from one side of the political spectrum to the other should be encouraged. Now, in my own personal experience, I can't think of one of my university or law school professors who didn't do this. Even the most conservative of my, say, constitutional law professors, they gave all perspectives, or at least they tried to. They made a good faith effort in doing so. But I've been out of school, admittedly, for a decade, so perhaps we need to enforce this form of free thought a little better. If students are primarily learning within the rigid framework of oppressed versus oppressor, where only certain groups can be one or the other, and where Israel and Jews cannot fit into the oppressed category in the modern era, there's something terribly wrong there. The world is not black and white, oppressed and oppressor, good and bad, right and wrong. Israelis make valid points about their conflict with Palestine, but Palestinians make many valid points about their conflict with Israel. It's the university's job to teach both sides of the conflict, force the students to argue both sides, and then ultimately let their critical thinking lead them to whatever conclusion they land on. But more importantly, it's a university's job to create a safe space for students to learn. It's their job to enforce their code of conduct in a colorblind and ethnicity-blind way. The presidents at Harvard, Penn, and MIT failed at that paramount responsibility, and they failed miserably. They revealed how morally bankrupt and wedded to a twisted pedagogy they truly are. And for that, they should all resign, or be forced to resign at least. If they don't, I can only hope more donors and trustees hit them where it hurts, their wallets. And I hope Congress does the same. That's all for Unartificially Intelligent this week, folks. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode, and keep thinking critically out there. See you next time.